Alrighty, so this is establishing the scene in steampunk live action roleplay by Mark Cohan. Just want to apologize, audio quality wise, is that my allergies are literally murdering me. Good old Santa Ana winds bringing in all those allergens, so I will wheeze my way through it, and hopefully you can understand me. Alrighty, so in this reading, the author talks about steampunk, where people are creating another world. And really, we tend to do this, create other worlds, when we're dissatisfied with the regular day-to-day world that we exist in. So steampunk itself is a leisure scene where people play with time and history, and they add a splash of Victorian science fiction. So they imagine and create a world that looks back to the 19th century, but imagines a new destiny for society, right? One where the mechanical age that they're giving homage to never gave rise to the digital age. So the incarnations of this vary, as some of these people see their world as an optimistic version of the future, or of a potential side reality, where other people perform it as very dystopian. So they're basically performing their fantasies into reality. When they create these worlds, they create characters and storylines, and they make the fantasy a reality, another interactive world that they live in. So to do this, they use art and skills, right? There's a deeply creative element to this. They make clothes, jewelry, other props from materials that would exist in that created world, meaning a world without digital technology. So I gave you a couple picture aids here. You have a couple at the top here, how they've created their own garments and not just fictitious backstories and elaborate, understandings in that way, but literally personifying it through creating all of these outfits and jewelry and props that go along with that performance. So live action role play. There's a lot of manifestations of this. There's basically as many forms as people can think up. So there's like cosplay versions, painting, sculpture, songs that are written and performed. Some are gamers, right? So LARP is a very interesting thing. I have a personal experience with this where I didn't participate in it, but I have a personal experience with not knowing what it means and how it affects your mental boundaries. So one night, my boyfriend and I were just taking a bike ride, riding around the neighborhood. We rode through one of the parks that was by our house, and there was this weird kind of a large group of people gathering in a tennis ball court area where there's like multiple courts next to each other but without like fences in between the courts, and the nets were not up, right? So there's just kind of like this big flat area, but that's kind of fenced off. And at first we didn't really pay it any mind. We're just kind of riding through the park, but then whoever was apparently the navigator of the scene basically yelled, start, and then people yelled charge, and they started just literally warring with each other. It was insane. It was completely insane because we just kind of came upon it. There's people with like their own props that they made of like swords, but they're just, big foam rubber things that they're smacking against each other. When they hit someone, then that person loses that limb or they fall to the ground dying. There was people that were firing objects that were really just like tennis balls that were hitting people. It was crazy. But to us, it was insane because we didn't understand the context. We don't understand what the rules and the boundaries are. Right? But if you play LARPing, or if you do this LARP, it's really an adventure improv, right? It's like a more dramatic Dungeons and Dragons type of adventure. And there is some crossover because there's, D&D is basically the gateway drug of LARPing. So the example in the reading is this Rise of Aster where, it includes a 500-page elaborate rule book to provide backstory and context so that when you interact, you understand what's happening. Because basically all play that we do has boundaries. So like in the reading, they talk about how simple games like hopscotch have rules, but you don't need a rule book because it's pretty basic. It's like jump in the squares and then not outside, right? Stay on 1 foot, things like that. It's pretty simple. But with LARP, you need a lot more boundaries to define the space and to make the interactions between players more meaningful in that space. So literally a 500-page elaborate rule book. I can't even get people to read their textbook. I couldn't imagine getting them to, as a leisure activity, read a 500-page manual on how to play a game, right? But it's really just, if you're a participant, you see yourself and others in the context of the space. That's that mental boundary. In this case, activity at a mining town bar or scientists on an exposition. But if you're not a member and you wander in, you're like WTF, right? It's just random people doing stuff that doesn't make sense to you. So the gamer carries the context in their mind. So the game becomes the social reality while they're playing the game. But, if you're just riding your bike through that park when it's happening, you're definitely confused like I was. So shared meaning explains why it works, because all the players accept the existence of the fictional world that, makes it a shared reality. And there are these navigators we'll talk about in a minute that keep it together. They're like the dungeon master in D&D. They set the scene, they guide and determine the consequences for players as they act on the environment and the players that are around them. And they decide any disputes that come up. So there's even these associate navigators that are directed by the navigator because the game is so complex. You need that many people to make it work. So before the game starts, players get an explanation of where they are in the story to catch them up and to assure a shared context. After everything's explained, they're asked to get in character and stay in character for game interactions. So, new boundaries come to life as the game begins. So the player can only interact in terms of the game. And the most prominent boundaries are those created by different types of participants in the game, and the social boundaries that divide the characters in the fictional milieu of the game, or, the setting of the game. So there's player characters, there's non-player characters, and navigators. So for player characters, these are the bulk of the gamers. They're playing characters that they inhabit and develop from scene to scene over multiple days of gaming. And these player characters are the most permanently real in the game. The game is kind of for them. So one of the examples in the chapter in the reading was Kat, who has an elaborate backstory and a multidimensional personality. So over the years, she developed complex and evolving relationships with other player characters, from lovers to hate-filled rivalries to sibling-like relationships. But there's no parallel in her real-life experiences with these people. Like, for example, her BFF is the girl that's also her rival. So in real life, she's her BFF. So it's these evolving relationships that happen in the game that make Kat a real character for Eliza, the actual human person playing her. Non-player characters are also important, but their status in reality is pretty temporary. They appear in scenes as sort of kind of interactive props that the character engages with or learns from, and sometimes clashes with in ways that move the story along. So another example from the reading would be Lady Gwendolyn Spivey, right? He kind of really lays out the way that she performs these characters. So she's an example of a non-player character that's part of the story only when she's needed for specific interactions, right? And then in the next scene, when the play moves to another setting, she's a different character. She's Mary, a drunk Scottish woman who's offering a guide to the travelers up the mountain, right? She goes from Lady Gwendolyn Spivey, who's very, professional and whatever, and documenting things for, this particular society. And then she changes character completely to someone that's uncontrolled, drunk, has a Scottish accent, all of these kind of things. But it makes sense because in the context of the first one, it's more of an exposition, and the context of the second one, if you're in a bar, kind of makes sense to be a person drinking. So anyway, these non-player characters kind of move the stories along, and they are interacted with by the player characters. The navigators are critical. So before the game, they are the essential organizers. They help players with last-minute details. They secretly prep the final elements of the story that are about to unfold, and they really exist outside the reality of the game. So one of the ways that people navigate these kind of conflicts is the fingers crossed gesture. This allows players to step out of character temporarily so they don't ruin the overall experience. I gave a picture example of it right here. This one character, because one of them is a non-player character, the other one is a player character but has stepped out of the scene for that moment. He is sitting there with a specific hand gesture to basically show that he's not in character in that moment, right? And this is just so you don't ruin it for everyone else. And the social divisions are interwoven into the social commitments of knowing the social rules that characterize the Victorian era. So this means knowing the gender boundaries, though those are mostly ignored. But there are also social class distinctions. So characters that are servers in the mining bar are going to act in the social position of servers. and not as like buddies to the characters. So challenges occur whenever a player or group of players wishes to act upon or is acted upon by another player, a non-player character, or the environment. So the success or failure of a challenge is determined by a formula that relates to an odd or even result previously determined strengths and weaknesses of the characters. So it's really all about building upon previous understandings and knowledge and evolving them over time, strengths and weaknesses of these particular characters. So these challenges are unique instances because they require the boundary between what is and what isn't part of the game to be managed with nuance, because the challenge itself is straddling the border between reality and fantasy. So creating steampunk is more complex than decorations. It's using objects and transforming them into something that's recognized in this alternate reality. So this shows us how the serious work of play, it shows us how reality is elastic and we can use our imaginations to create other realities. So LARP is a collective reality or production of fantasy, and these LARPs show how the production of reality works inside and outside the game. So I'm also going to include some clips from one of my absolute favorite films, Not for the Faint of Heart, Role Models, right? Which obviously includes a very memorable character that is very interested in LARPing. So I'm going to give you, well, at least a couple of the clips I could find on YouTube, because if I add the videos to this lecture, it will be flagged for copyright infringement, which is like a whole problem for me that keeps happening. So anyway, I'm just going to add them as additional things for your weekly assignment so that you can, if you watch those couple clips, just a few minutes long, you'll see how all of these things come to life when it comes to the navigators, the player characters, the non-player characters. And really, the comedy of the aspect lies in the fact that one of the people is new and doesn't have the understanding of the boundaries or the rules or what are involved in the LARPing. So kind of like my experience with riding a bike through a park and seeing a bunch of random people hit each other with sticks and throw tennis balls at each other and be like, what the hell is that? It's a similar kind of experience of when you don't know the social reality, how you don't know how to act in the social reality. So I'm going to include those as well.